We are starting off the next session of Simon and Denny Ask Us Anything. Today's theme is data mesh. We're going to wait a few minutes for people to trickle in from all three locations of LinkedIn plus YouTube. Hopefully that works today. And of course, the Linux Foundation Zoom. So just give us a few minutes. If you want to chime in and into the chat and tell us where you're based out of. Simon, you are based out of?
I'm based in sunny Kent in England, where it's turning into nighttime and it's been grey and miserable all day. But that's nothing new for the country currently.
Got it. And I'm Denny, and I'm based out of Seattle. It is a little foggy and smoky due to some wildfires, but overall enjoying it. So give us a few minutes. I'm going to go ahead and check what's going on with our LinkedIn and with our YouTube at the same time. So yeah, just give us a sec.
I'm going to go ahead and just remind people watching, we don't have many questions in yet. So if you want to know, if you've got any burning questions, then please put them in either in the chat here, in the chat in YouTube, in the chat in LinkedIn, anywhere you are watching. Feel free to ping some questions and we'll try and just pick up as many as we can. Generally on the theme of data mesh today, which could be, what is it? Could be, why is it? Could be, how do you achieve it? Could be, is it hype? Loads of questions. So let us know. Hang in.
Awesome. And looks like we are good to go. We are live on YouTube. We are live on LinkedIn. So for all the folks that are chiming in, let us know where you're based out of. Hey, we got hi, Vinny from Ireland. You can welcome aboard. For the folks here in Zoom, the Linux Foundation Zoom, cool. Welcome aboard. And also for the folks from YouTube, welcome aboard. All right, perfect. Well, so since we don't have any questions yet, like I said before, this is an Ask Us Anything session. So we definitely want y'all to go ahead and ask us questions. But before we dive into the questions, why don't we start some context around this concept of data mesh? And the reason we decided to do today's session had a lot to do with, would I be correct in saying, Simon, a rant that you did a few weeks ago?
Yeah. I mean, I will hold my hand up and thoroughly apologize to the data mesh community for the perhaps harsh words I might have uttered in my rant. Perhaps wasn't the kindest to the movement. Basically, we had Big Data London over in the UK recently, and there's a massive explosion of people going, yes, mesh is amazing, mesh is great. And it's kind of been a thing recently in terms of lots of people have been picking it up and running with it as the latest and greatest thing. I want to make sure we'll talk about what mesh is. We'll talk about my rant specifically. Isn't about data mesh. It's not saying data mesh as a concept is flawed. I'm just annoyed that there are so many people currently out in the world trying to sell the whole of it, everything that is data mesh, to organizations when they're just not ready for it. Because it's kind of a big thing. This is why I try and articulate what mesh is without going down a giant rabbit hole.
But honestly, you probably have to go down a rabbit hole because, for example, like part of the reason why I was interested wasn't just because of the popularity of the session of your video, right? Part of it's also because just the week before, I had done exactly this, where I had chatted with Ryan Harris from HSBC about building up their cybersecurity data mesh in order for them to go ahead and do what they did. And then there's lots of environments where we do technically talk about data mesh and the complexities involved with that. So as much as we joke or tease about the fact that there's a rant going back and forth, the reality is, no, I think you're exactly right. There is a complexity that people forget about when it comes to how to build data meshes correctly. And so, yeah, why don't we start with the definitions first, and then we can go from there, because I don't actually think you need to apologize to anybody in the data mesh community, because you just being you, right? The reality is that this concept is actually, people think it's just like, oh, there's a tech and you're done, right? It's like, no, it's people, it's processes, it's like, heck, even like the boring aspects of procurement even kick in, and yet they're actually so important. So
apologies to all the people from procurement who happen to be watching on Denny's harsh words.
no. I actually think procurement and logistics is actually freaking amazing, by the way. So before we started the session, I was actually talking about there's a really good YouTuber named Perun, excuse me, Perun. He actually talks about the logistics and procurement processes for example, the Ukrainian war, which is actually really, really interesting, by the way. So no, quite the opposite. Procurement's actually a really interesting topic, but I will not do it because I'm not as talented as him when it comes to it, even though I'm a bit of a nerd on that topic. But back to the point at hand, data mesh. By the way, we do already have some questions kicking in, but let's provide some context first before we go ahead and start answering questions. Okay.
I mean, so probably just easier to cover, so the introductory parts of everything, you read about the 4 pillars, right? The four central tenets of data mesh. In a nutshell, it's the whole idea of going, things are too centralized currently. Data engineering has become too specialized. It's too actually, everything's going through a tight tunnel of where we should be getting data from, how we should be getting data from a variety of operational sources through to the analytics users who need to use it. And saying it's time for a change, we need to shake things up. And the whole thing is basically saying the entire organization should be restructured around this idea of decentralized data ownership. So you got these 4 main things. So 1, decentralized data ownership, saying actually it's not a central team. There isn't a data team. You don't have this data engineering team. It's not like one central function who's doing all that stuff. But actually any kind of core function in the business who's producing data has responsibility for their own data. And from an organizational point of view, absolutely makes sense. We've been trying desperately from data governance for years to say, can you just please take responsibility for the data you're giving us over and over again? And that's what data governance is about. It's about data stewardship. It's about measuring data quality, but then putting accountability for the quality of data back on the people producing it. So it's a spin on that. It's about organizing it and treating it seriously and taking accountability for who owns the actual data. But data is a product, the next tenet. And that's the seriousness of data, right? Saying, well, actually, data is so important. Treat it as the end product of the output of your labor. It's saying treat it as something that has intrinsic value. Make sure it's testable. Make sure it is valuable. It's quality. If you're going to make sure the software you build is good quality software, you should make sure that the data produced by that is of equivalent value or even in greater value than the software that produces it. So it's about changing the mindset about data. Data is not a side effect. Data is not a thing that just trickles out the side of the application you've built. Data is the golden thing that's actually coming out and treating it with the due respect it needs. Absolutely makes a lot of sense. Self-serve data infrastructure as a platform. And this is kind of a hard one. And this is, I think, the one that so many tech vendors have jumped on, going, hey, what you want technology that allows you to share data? Great. Implement our tool and you have a magical mesh. And absolutely, one of the central things is just make it really easy for people to share data. That's the fundamental thing. If it becomes easy and you don't need massive specialist skills, you don't need serious data engineering. I've been doing data engineering for 15 years, so only I can share data. Make it really easy for people to spin up copies of this kind of real easy self-serve data infrastructure and share it. If you have all those things in it, it enables the mesh, but it's not the mesh in itself. And then like federated governance of actually managing how you do that. Who's actually computing it? How much are you paying for that stuff? How much are you actually expending getting all this stuff working? So there's like the balance of those 4 things is a huge expenditure of work and organizational change and people. It's about changing the structure of teams. It's about changing the skills and expectations and accountability of teams. And then when you've reorganized your entire structure so that every team is focused on the data they produce, then you can enable it with technology to actually then stand up something like a mesh. And yeah, the rant's all about people going in going, right, you need to build a mesh. Here's a technology. And it's not taking account of the vast amount of organizational change that would need to happen to do that, but also the technology maturity the company needs to do it. Mm-hmm. And actually just the vast, disparate, horrible nature of most companies is if you had a mesh that had a couple of bits of data in there and it doesn't account for the rest of your data estate, that's not really as useful. You're still going to have a centralized team who gets the other data. Saying we have this nirvana of distributed data nodes that are stood up in nice things and they're easily accessible by APIs and they're enshrined as products. But actually, there's 90% of the company's data still goes through the centralized team. Doesn't really affect the organization. Doesn't really kind of tick that problem.
Right.
So yeah, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about this big shift towards decentralization, a shift towards how differently we think about data and thinking of it as a product. But also thinking about there's a bit of a gold rush of just many, many companies being told they have to have a mesh. And so they're jumping on it, even if they're not culturally ready for it.
Right. So to add to your point, and I'm going to take a more of a software engineering standpoint, it's just like when back in the aughts, we made that shift to SOA, service-oriented or architectures, and I don't have the diagram handy, and we don't do diagrams here anyways, but right, there's that diagram of, if you look at all these services within Amazon and how they actually interact with each other, basically it's this gigantic graph of nodes interacting with each other. And in the past, like a software engineering architect, that person, he or she, would be able to go ahead and tell you what the entire architecture was from end to end. And when you looked at the Amazon services, we're talking about tens of thousands of services interacting with each other. It was impossible for one person to know how every single one of these services worked. And so the whole purpose was to go ahead and say, okay, you're responsible for the input. There's a contract for what the output is. And so this is sort of the same concept when it came to this idea of data mesh. It's like, okay, you have a contract for what the input is. You have a contract for what the output is. Each team is now then responsible for that product/service of data that they're producing, ensuring its quality. If, exactly to your point, just like during the gold rush of everybody's, it's service, everything's service, and then of course now we're into serverless for that matter, but that's besides the point. We'll wait for that debate on a later day. The context is that all of a sudden we're having people that did not have, who are, like, for example, still doing waterfall methods as opposed to agile development, not understanding the concept of DevOps. They're all of a sudden going ahead and trying to say, oh, no, we've got ourselves a service. And we're like, okay, you still have a monolithic environment. All you did is put a REST API in front of it. That's making a REST API does not make it a service. It's right. You actually have to break it down to its vital points, and your team actually needs to understand how to do everything end to end. It's not just about the development. They actually have to do the testing. They have to actually make sure it goes to production. That's why DevOps became popular, because they actually have to care about what services that they maintain and that they also produce themselves. And if they don't care about that, all of a sudden this thing falls apart and they're the only people to blame. Data mesh is this exact same concept when it comes to data, right? You actually have to have the people themselves, the processes themselves, actually ready for all of this. And if you don't have the people and processes put in place, guess what? Doesn't matter what tech you throw on it, it'll still fail.
Yeah.
Fair enough?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. So you and I have equally both done our little bit of rants, but then let's go ahead and start going in and actually answering some questions. So I'm going to jump between, right now it looks like most of the questions are from LinkedIn, but I'm going to start with the Linux Foundation Zoom first. Chris asked the question, so what does a company need to do to be ready for data mesh? You want to tackle that one first?
Well, I mean, there's a massive, massive question.
Yes, it is. So I'll help out too. Don't worry.
I mean, so firstly, yeah, I mean, it depends if you're trying to say the company is entirely shifting to an entire mesh architecture. If they're saying we're going to culturally reorganize how we speak about it and how we do things, and that's kind of too huge to be achievable for most companies that aren't, one, an absolute greenfield startup doing it from the very start, or two, just have so much money and time they just fancy doing something slightly crazy. You can start investing in it. So one, if you're a tech firm, it helps. So a lot of the way that the likes of the books and the principles talk about it is, if you are building an application and your application is already producing and maintaining the core sources of data, then starting to organize those things around and treating their data as products and starting tackling it one by one, standing up these things and actually sort of treating them seriously as products and iterating it over, starting the long, long slog of treating your various data sources as products and starting to build it out. So targeting the ones that actually could do with sharing, starting to treat the organizational side of your data as products and starting to work that out. So rather than take the entire organization and treat the entire organization as a giant mesh, starting to treat the connectivity of various different applications and the data that they have as their own constellations of meshes, whatever you want to call it. So you can then actually start to put in the processes, put in the practices, put in the repeatable, kind of self-serve bits that you can then stand up to support the rest of it. Because if you're trying to do a big bang rollout across an entire organization, it's way too much than most places can actually do. The challenge is when you start talking about, the analytical side of things. And again, crossing that bridge, right? Crossing that bridge between all my various different application data products, if you started to manage to stand up those and treat them as products, over to actually, here's all my different uses of analytics. Here's all my different ways I've taken my customer master data list, my stats around kind of, my most sold products, various different analytical products that you're creating, trying to treat those as reusable components. It's kind of funny because that's kind of what warehousing and things have been trying to do for years, and trying to treat, consolidated conform dimensions, but trying to treat those as individual things, not tied to a data model. And that, again, it just requires a lot of investment, a lot of thinking about how you're organizing it. So a lot of it is breaking up the problem, tackling it in smaller parts, and then starting to address the cultural change of how you build in data ownership and how you actually sort of manage it, I guess.
Yeah, no, and I'd love to add to exactly what your call outs here. So, for example, I'm going to go back to the software cycle because part of the reason why I actually like doing this is not just because I bring a different perspective, but also that if you look at the way data engineering is these days, the software development lifecycle and the data engineering lifecycle, they're actually merging together, right? The concept is that in the past, a data engineer could be just somebody who did SQL and they're good to go, and this idea of repeatability or versioning of code was pretty much non-existent. And so nowadays, the data engineer, that person is seen as very similar, if not the same person as a software engineer, just because of the fact that they actually have to have that same repeatability, testability, all these other aspects. And the reason I bring that up is because it goes back to that same concept of DevOps, right? So for example, one of the companies I had worked with in the past was a company called Concur. Great company, loved working there. But the reason I wanted to bring that up is because we were just trying to switch to Agile from waterfall. That's something as simple as that. This was a process that took us over a year. Okay, we actually had to train all 2,000 of our employees, not just the developers. The business people actually realized that if they themselves switched over to Agile development, they could actually stay more in sync with their own development teams. So the business themselves could actually go ahead and actually get their features out faster. So they themselves realized, oh, this is actually beneficial for us too. This isn't just a software problem. So what was really cool about the company is that then it was a massive cultural shift for the entire company. And so it wasn't just the software developers, it was everybody, including procurement, right? The whole premise was that we would actually change. And so there are multiple training sessions. We would go off site and we would have these training sessions at like these big hotel conference rooms specifically to go ahead and get us up to speed. And that's just one small aspect, right? This is just going from waterfall to Agile. And obviously building services is much more than just that. So the other things we did, or simple things, are like we had small teams that started off first that would go ahead and experiment to see what worked and what didn't work. We would not go ahead and try to take the biggest systems and try to convert them right away. We'd take smaller systems or newer systems that could go ahead and be built as services first and get into the idea of the cloud right away. And then over time, we would then take those lessons learned, apply that to everybody and train everybody. And so this is a process that takes time. This isn't something that happens overnight. It took us basically about 2 years for that conversion to actually happen. And data mesh basically is the same concept, right? It'll take time, not so much because of the technology, but because you actually have to change the culture of your organization to do such a thing.
Yeah. And again, I do think there's elements of it which is fairly naive to expect large companies to do it. Kind of expecting the pure business teams, expecting your marketing teams and those kind of people to actually take technical ownership for the maintenance of a product.
Yeah.
And you go through the data mesh book, and it's talking about the emergence of technology generalists and everyone having to be a little bit technical. And it's like,
really? Yeah.
It's like, I'm not going to go into an operational team. So the team of the procurement team, the marketing team, the HR team, or whoever that might be, I go, right, you guys have got some data. You now have to be techies. You now are looking after a technical product. And that's kind of what it's angling at and going, data is everyone's responsibility. And absolutely, it's true. but also the technical ownership and the technical production of the data is everyone's responsibility, is kind of fundamental to some of the concepts in it. And I think that's just a little bit unrealistic. I think many companies are going to really struggle to adopt that kind of mindset. And I'm going to dive into a business and go, hey, you got to learn some tech because I'm going to get pushback. I'm going to get laughed out of the room, or they're going to run away from me from being an overly enthusiastic tech guy.
No, that's actually a good call out, dude. And actually, in fact, I'm hopefully I'm saying his name correctly. Runika Prasad from LinkedIn actually was asking that question: is what are the data meshes not good at? I think you literally just answered that question, so I think that's perfect. So perfect. All right, let's go to the next question. Now, this is a little bit more specific. Is a data lake house better than the data mesh and the data fabric? Okay. And that's a little bit interesting. So do you want to tackle that first, or do you want me to tackle that first?
I'll let you give the formal answer.
No problem. Okay. Well, I wouldn't say formal. It is me, so that's that's debatable whether you want to say formal. Okay. The problem is right now is actually the definitions. Okay. Remember, data mesh is more about the processes that you put in place. Okay, in terms of actually saying, okay, do I have which parts of it are centralized? And in general, data mesh is trying to decentralize everything. But in all seriousness, most successful, at least what I've seen, data meshes have, yes, there is technical responsibility that is decentralized out, but there still is a central core team that if for no other reason, at minimum establishes data dictionary, governance, and processes. At maximum, provide consulting services or professional services to the various teams, so that way they all run on the same standardization. It's okay, for sake of argument, that one team wants to run their data processing on Rust because I love Rust, and then another team runs on Python. That's fair. But by the same token, maybe the central core team has decided that they're going to standardize on Python. So in other words, the team that wants to go Rust, you're more than welcome to do it. But guess what? You're responsible for fulfilling these contracts if you do such a thing, which is versus the team that goes on Python, they'll go ahead and already have templates put in place for sake of argument. That's really what the concept of the data mesh is about, that centralization, decentralization, push back and forth. The data lakehouse is a different concept altogether, right? The lakehouse is basically saying, I'm taking this idea of the warehouse, okay, the data warehouse of the past, right? In other words, this is what I typically, okay, because I'm an old fogey from the SQL Server years. The concept is the V1 of business data is the database, basically version 1, right? Basically, we put everything in a database. We, especially when I was a SQL Server, like we basically, every single solution involved us basically shoving all the data into SQL Server. We built store procedures. Is a cursor function? Doesn't matter. We'll figure out how to write a store procedure that figures out how to do the equivalent of a cursor function without being a cursor function, still be fast. Okay, that was great, but it really did not provide us that flexibility. Okay, and especially when it came to data science, in terms of being able to go ahead and process lots of semi-structured data. Version 2, this is concept of data lakes. That's great. I was actually partially to blame for parts of it because I kept on going schema on read. I still want to apologize for pushing that. That lasted 3 months, and then I realized I was full of BS. So I'm still paying penance today for pushing that idea. But the context was that you have a data lake, often it's HDFS or cloud object storage, where you can put all your data inside there, except there was no structure to it. And so the lake house is version 3. It's the best of both worlds. It's the best of taking the transactional concept of your database plus the concept of the flexibility of your data lake, merging them together, i.e. best of both worlds, i.e. that's the data lake house. The data mesh and the lake house are actually orthogonal to each other. You can absolutely build a mesh with multiple lake houses. Okay. So those are two very different concepts. And now when it comes to data fabric, honestly, it really depends on what you mean by data fabric. Okay. So often, more times than not, the fabric is, for example, if I was to go Microsoft on you, I would say things like the service fabric, i.e. what is the services that you spin up to go ahead and operate spin up various VMs, spin up various resources for your system. On the other hand, when it comes to data fabric, it's more like, did you build an infrastructure, right, that goes ahead and actually suffices all your data needs, for example, for machine learning, for streaming, and everything else. Some people will claim the data fabric would be like, well, since I'm from Databricks, haha, Databricks is the data fabric, using that example. There are services from Amazon, Google, Microsoft that actually do the same thing. By the same token, other people will define data fabric as much lower level. So it really depends on what your definition of fabric. I do not think there is a solidified answer to that particular question. So I'm not going to, so that's why I'm leaving it like this, because I'm going, we can literally go on for hours just on that particular debate on what's the definition of fabric. But the key concept is these are all also orthogonal from each, from the concept of data lakehouse and also data mesh. So what do you think? Did I answer most of it, or anything you think we should add?
I think that makes sense. I just simply said lakehouse is a place you can stand up several products, several data products. It's just a tech platform you can use to stand things up. The mesh, the fabric, is more the organizational wide estate of everything that might be. And as you said, you can have a mesh of lakehouses. You can have a mesh that's a couple of lakehouses, some other stuff. Depends on size and shape, right?
Yeah, easy. Absolutely. Perfect.
There's another question in LinkedIn I was going to pick up with the MDM.
Please do it.
So if we're talking about master data management, again, as an old school data warehouser, it's a thing close to my heart, right? I spent a lot of time master data management, doing, golden customer records, all of that kind of stuff. And that one is one that fits really easy into the concept of mesh. It's one of the few things that actually just easily makes sense, right? Because it's essentially, you can treat it like a microservice. Having something where saying, I input all of my customers, I do, whatever kind of fuzzy matching, whatever golden record establishment I can do, and standing up something that is like a web service to say, here's this customer, return me the golden record ID. Do a lookup and tell me the master customer record can be treated in isolation from all these other data products and should be treated as a centralized service that is used by many, many federated tools. That's the point of a master data management system. So whereas you get all these different analytical products that you could argue, well, do you need to separate? Do they need decentralization? How easy it is to pull them apart and make them, microservices? MDM, master data management, absolutely lends itself to being a decentralized service that various different, both operational and analytical products should be talking to and consuming as their source of master data. In a nutshell, yes.
Cool, awesome.
That was an easy one.
No, yeah, it was simple. Yeah. And by the way, sorry, I wanted to chime in. There was some back and forth about this concept of maybe perhaps Databricks is the only way to do data mesh. And I just want to clarify again, absolutely not. Even just in our previous riff, remember, data mesh is very much about this concept of merging processes with the tech. And honestly, it's more about the processes, which actually was going to segue to one of the questions that was asked in the Zoom. So we'll go to that one next. But very much the concept is that it is much more about the processes and how you decentralize. Yes, since I'm from Databricks, I obviously will be biased toward it. Let's not pretend I'm not biased, but I'm certainly not stating that this is the only tech. Quite the opposite. There's a lot of good technologies out there that allow you to data mesh. And what the number one reason for the failures of data mesh is not technology. The number one reason for failures is the processes, the cultural shift that did not happen. That just want to call that out.
I mean, in terms of when we talk about tech, right at the start, we talked about the 4 pillars. And one of them is a self-service kind of analytics infrastructure, a real cookie cutter thing you can just deploy, stand up, that allows people to start surfacing, allows people to standing up these data product APIs without a huge load of tech workaround. And that could be some little services you've written. It could be something custom and bespoke that you've done. It could be that is a virtualization service that's kind of you're sitting there and you're registering your various different things in there. So Databricks have answers where if you wanted Databricks as part of that technology stack you're using to standing up a mesh, then we've talked, Unity Catalog is there as a central metadata system that's available if you're using Databricks. So you have lots of different Databricks workspaces. That's the way of sharing things amongst it. But Delta sharing being the more true mesh thing, when you're standing up an API, you're standing up a server with various different APIs. You stand up an API for each of the different shares that you're doing. And so you could have a mesh that is made up of various different things like the application server just standing up APIs on its own because it's a web service or a web server. The Databricks itself standing up APIs via the Delta sharing server inside Unity Catalog. Another thing standing up an API via a virtualization thing. And the whole thing is having that idea of these different services being poked up, a la microservices. That is how you get your data from various different things. So can Databricks be part of a mesh? Sure, because the technology that's in there to enable you to stand up APIs that you could use as part of a wide array of different technologies that you're implementing your mesh as part of. Is the only way to do a mesh Databricks? Nah. That's it. There's many different ways to skin that cat, but that is just addressing that one of the principles, which is make it easy with the tech. And it does not work if you haven't done the hard part of the organizational ownership, the concept of treating data like a product, the concept of decentralizing ownership. It's just not there with a quick tech sticky plaster.
So, in other words, if you get nothing else from today's riff with Simon and myself, there is no magic wand. Simple as that. Okay.
And if someone rocks up and tells you they have a product that's going to magically make them a mesh, chase them out the building.
Exactly. Absolutely. All right, let's dive. We got some other really good questions I want to dive into. So I hopefully I'm saying your name correctly. Dalibor asked a question from the Linux Foundation Zoom. And the question is, do you really agree with the authors of data mesh principles that data owners should recruit from the business side of a domain? Do you think that it's realistic? And now this is his personal opinion. He says he doesn't believe that they possess the skills and, more importantly, the attitude to carry on such a mash of data that they must work with. Okay. Want to tackle that first, or would you like me to tackle that first?
I mean, it depends on timescales, right? Because there's a time a long time ago, back, when we started talking about the last wave of decentralization that the industry went through, which is everyone should do their own reporting. I don't want to get sent an email that has like sort of a PDF in there. I want like users to go in, explore, cut and slice data, open up Excel. And there's this similar backlash of going, why should I do my own reporting? That's the data team's job. I'm not a data monkey. You're a data monkey. Make me some reports, data monkey. And that's, there's pushback in terms of the upskill, the data literacy. How data literate should the general business be? And if you look now compared to 10 years ago, compared to 20 years ago, the data literacy of people just generally in the workplace is massively different. And I think that's almost kind of what we're talking about in this kind of future, kind of saying, is it reasonable to expect like a business team to look after essentially a technical product? Currently, no, not except for some quite rare companies, or some very niche pockets within those companies. Maybe, is it right to say we shouldn't have that vision and shouldn't expect in 10 years time, in 15 years time, then actual generally businesses will be that level of tech maturity higher, that not saying that everyone's going to be a techie and everyone's going to be sitting there coding away, but saying actually to have a slight bit of software mentality, a slight bit of thinking about products and thinking about product ownership to permeate through various different business domains. Is that unrealistic? Maybe not. Is it right now? Not for everybody, absolutely not. I don't know whether that's the way the world's going, but I think we're talking about that kind of timescales if we do go that way. It's basically a whole cultural shift of the industry that generally people in these roles are getting more technical, or getting more, at least more data savvy, a little bit more savvy about how these things work. So right now, no, but is it something we should aspire to? Not to say that we shouldn't be heading in that direction. It's more to say we're not there now.
No, that's a great answer. And the only thing I could probably add to that is, especially because I got to bear witness and be participate in the exactly what you're talking about, like the generation of originally BI was some core central team, and then we finally built the concept of self-service BI, and so then that's where the outcome of not just using Excel with Power Pivot, but then also pivot tables, but then also Excel with Power Pivot, then also Excel with Power BI, and then Power BI itself as its own tool. Like in the end, a lot of this is exactly what Simon called out. It is about time. It is about progression. The teams that will end up getting the most out of their data are going to be the ones that actually can work well with the people in the business, right? Because the business are the ones, whether they meant to be or not, they're the product managers, quote unquote, to define what metrics they need to get out of their data. And then they're going to use those metrics to make decisions on where the business goes. And so unless you're working closely with the business in the first place, and or the business is working closely with the data folks, you're not going to actually get people to actually collaborate on this front. And if they're not, then all of a sudden you're not getting the most or the maximum out of the data you have. That's what it boils down to. And so exactly like Simon called out, are we able to go ahead and have them run just for the fun of it? Do I expect, like, the business domain person to run Flink jobs? Absolutely not. Never. Okay. I absolutely don't expect them to do that. Do I expect Flink to get easier over time? And so that way you don't have to be an uber expert with it? Absolutely, I do. Exactly. And that's the progression of the technology with the business. Over time, we're going to make the technology a little bit easier, and the people who are in the business are going to become more data literate, more data savvy. And that's always what's going to happen, basically.
Kind of meeting in the middle, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That gets easier. People get more savvy. And eventually, whichever line it ends in, well, I just reminded the theme park, the old game where you're trying to get handshakes. That's kind of how I think about the business and technology coming together.
Right.
But then obviously we talk about that cultural shift, right? And there's still companies out there now who aren't at that level of maturity. There's still companies now who they're not data driven. They're not thinking about data insights. They're not decentralized reporting, and they think about things in very old school ways. And there's companies who are way ahead of it. It's not like we're all on the same line, kind of maturing at the same pace. There'll be people who are ready for this kind of thinking now. And there'll be people who won't be ready for this kind of thinking for 30, 40 years. It's a big old shift, a big old continuum of how mature companies are and how they think about this stuff.
Cool. Okay. I just realized we actually have a lot of questions in LinkedIn that we have not answered.
Okay.
So let's go through them, and let's you and I both actually stop talking so much. All right. So I'm calling myself out too here. So Daniel Clark has asked a question from LinkedIn. Hi guys, big fan. Thank you very much. Do you have any eyes on existing tools or tech that would open data ownership to the non-techie layman or average business user?
It depends. Depends on what we specify as a data API, right?
Mm-hmm.
It depends on how purist you're being in the technology that could come together to form a mesh. So yeah, you could just grab a lakehouse, and just as long as every data source is registered wherever it might be, you could say that's kind of a mesh because you've got technology standard. Now the management of that is very centralized. It's not as truly open. It's not as completely kind of domain agnostic, completely self-managing. If you're going completely the other way and saying everything has to stand up a web service, everything is purist, it's an API in the most pure definition of an API, it's really hard to get people to adopt it. So I don't think there is a technical standard. I don't think there is a thing that makes it super, super easy right now. I think the closest that we have is the kind of semantic layers you see in various different BI tools, just being able to collect and register. That still requires someone central usually. Still requires someone to go around and connect up all these different data sources. The virtualization tools that kind of do that kind of thing of saying, right, we're just a virtual layer. Your data can be anywhere. We'll plug you all in. Most of them require infra, tin. Someone needs to manage it. Someone needs to look after that stuff. And again, that requires its own level of management. So plenty of tools that make it easy for business people to connect and register something, but not to spin it up and manage it themselves. That still has to be someone provides a platform, someone manages that platform, and then there's different flavors that allow users to go and hook tables in, hook tech in. But as a single thing that enables business users to stand up their own in a real layperson way, I've not seen one that's convincing, honestly.
No, great answer. Let me dive into the next question, just because, like I said, we have got other ones. Pedro has basically asked the question, how should data governance be handled in the mesh concept? From a real technical perspective here. And he's saying, don't give us beautiful answers, get your hands dirty. No problem. So Pedro, I'm going to give you a beautiful answer first, only because it's actually pointing you to a long answer. A couple of weeks ago, there was a D3L2 session that I did with Ryan Harris about cybersecurity and data mesh that actually gives you the context of exactly how do you do data governance, because that's exactly what it was. This is at HSBC. How do they apply governance to their model? Long story short, though, the TLDR version of this, basically, so that way you understand. In the end, when it comes to going ahead and saying governance, you actually have to build policies. I know that doesn't sound like a technical answer, but that's actually the first thing you have to do. There actually has to be policies on your data to define, like, for example, there's often people will categorize as it like, is it HBI, MBI, or LBI, like high business impact, medium business impact, low business impact. And there's various security associations or privacy that goes with that, okay? Because that's one of the first things on data from a data mesh you actually have to be worried about. When you share data, what data can you share and who can you share it with? Okay. If you have not built these policies in place in the first place, you can't even do the concept of sharing your data. Forget about mesh, just sharing the data to even to another organization that's right next to you. Okay. Because what ends up happening is that there's always fiduciary responsibilities when it comes to the governance of your data. Okay. Whether you're talking about Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, High Health Act, whatever, GDPR, I don't care. Like there's all of these different acronyms for governance. And in the end, what it boils down to is that you have to know exactly what happens to your data, who modified it, and who are you sharing it with, and just as importantly, how to delete it and ensure that you've actually deleted it correctly. Okay. So that's what I'm saying. This is a very dirty answer. Okay. But it starts with the beautiful answer of basically building the policies. When you actually apply the technologies, literally, we can take a whole session just to talk about GDPR. Okay. In fact, I think one of the sessions we were supposed to do was that actually, so maybe we will go back and bring this session back out. So for example, some cases are simple things like, okay, if you're going to delete the data, some people will say, okay, you must delete the data and have a transaction log that goes with it. For example, since we talk about Delta Lake a lot, that's exactly what happens. You delete the data, you go ahead and actually have a log that specifies that the data was deleted. But in some cases, people say, no, you can't do that because you actually update it first and update it to null. Why? You keep the ID so that way downstream systems know that they have to go ahead and delete their data too. So that way there's a lineage that allows you to understand that not only did you delete it from the source system, you delete it from the target system, and so forth and so forth. So in the end, everything I'm talking about isn't so much from a technical aspect. It's actually about saying, what are your policies? And then writing the code to do that. There are different technological solutions that come into place from different vendors that do various degrees of that. But even if you were to take all of them together, you will still need to glue it all together. Okay. So in the end, it's still work that you have to do. And again, just to harp on this point one more time, you have to define the policy first. And then finally, when it comes to the concept of data mesh, typically, more times than not, there will be a central governance team that will define that, okay? Because in the end, your business is going to have to define, yes, that particular ID is an HBI, it can never be shared, and then that has to be applied to everything else. And when you delete the data from a GDPR context, yes, the source system is deleted. What is the lineage to track every single system that potentially had utilized this information and delete that as well? So all of these things in the end are about policies. Hopefully that provides you at least a high level concept. I've already talked a little too much as it is. But again, check out the D3L2 session, cybersecurity with Ryan Harris at HSBC, that provides you a lot more of those details, because this is a banking environment in which we were talking about data mesh and governance. So hopefully that answers that question.
I would say that yes, absolutely answers data governance as a plane of how you govern a data estate. I'd say there's another angle that also needs to be taken into account, which is the data as a product. Because when you build a bit of software, when you're picking something off the backlog and you're delivering a feature, that feature has acceptance criteria and it has a definition of done. So it's the other angle of governance in terms of saying, how good's a data product? How do you make sure, so one of the traditional parts of data governance in a traditional analytics architecture is a data steward measuring quality metrics, saying the quality of this product is 80%. How do you define that? What are the standards? What are the metrics that you use to define quality? And DQ is, that for me, the other pillar of data governance, right? So you got the regulatory governance, the who can see what data, who's allowed to see things, how do we categorize it, what data is exposed across my entire estate. But you've got how do you hold people accountable for standing up that data product? How do they, before they deliver something, they go, no, this doesn't meet my quality gates. I can't deploy my application because it's going to drop my data product and it's going to ruin the quality of my data product. Therefore, it's not met its acceptance criteria. So it's about kind of as well as having kind of the governance artifact for the regulatory point of view, it's about baking in that whole the metrics, how you define that, what things people have to tick before they're allowed to stand up, or before they take their own pride, hopefully, their own accountability to stand up a data product. How do you define that? And having that common set of standards. And it might be that central governance team. It might be another kind of bodies coming up with essentially one, there might be a technology fix. I mean, how are you measuring data quality? There might be a set of tools and rules and things that you apply to it. It might just be a set of processes that each team who is standing up a data product adheres to, and they publish and go, right, here's our data quality metrics. We promise that for this product, we will always meet these things. And they publish it, and that's a data set of their own. And part of a good working mesh, you should be able to say, of all the various different products out there, what's the quality of that one? What's the quality of that one? What's the quality of that one? And have that visibility and have that openness, because without that transparency and visibility of quality of the data, it's going back to, oh God, we're not sure, so we're going to have to pull it into a central place, and then you've ruined the whole point of it, right?
Exactly. By the way, you Chima, hopefully I said that person's name correctly, asked that exact question in the Zoom, which is how data mesh can help tackle the data quality issues. Exactly right. So I think you've covered that concept. And one thing, for example, I did want to call out to, this is always a problem, like whether it's data engineering or software engineering, like the things that you still have the exact same problem within a single lakehouse. You want to have those same metrics. You want to have the same data quality issues. For example, one of the things that we're doing with Delta Lake, which isn't so much a data problem, though it technically is because it involves Delta Lake itself, is that we actually built a new process called DAT, Delta Acceptance Testing. It's boring, but it allowed me to go ahead and name the new sessions What's Up with DAT. So that's just me being a geek, a dork, excuse me. But the context is that we have so many different integrations, like, for example, the Golang, upcoming Golang one, we have Flink, Presto, Trino, Athena, whatever, the Rust APIs, Kafka Delta, just yada, yada, yada. Okay, we have so many different systems that are trying to interact with Delta that we actually have to have centralized testing. Okay, now the testing isn't centralized from the standpoint of like, sorry, I want to clarify. The centralizing is not the actual test. Each one of these projects is responsible for testing it and outputting those metrics, but there's a centralized location to define what are we testing, define how we're supposed to measure it. And so that way we can all go ahead and say, yes, Delta Rust does X, Y, and Z. Delta, the Python bindings does A, B, and C, and so forth and so forth. And so this is everywhere, right? And so the mesh only makes it a little harder, basically.
Yeah, that's fair.
Cool. Okay, I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
One final point. Final point to close that down is the big message, which again, most of the people who spoke to me after I was ranting online about mesh being a terrible thing to try and implement wholeheartedly were like, but that's not the point. You're not meant to try and implement all of it now. And that idea of data as a product, essentially treating data as a thing that has acceptance criteria, that has kind of a set of rules, has a definition of done, you can just implement that as its own, as a process you start trying to embed throughout your organization. You don't have to try and embrace and build a mesh. You don't have to say, yeah, we're building mesh absolutely everywhere. You can just say, right, we're going to implement a load of processes to implement data as a product and try and build that community, that sense of pride, the sense of accountability in those metrics. And people have been doing that as a governance thing for years. And it's got a shiny new name, cool. But it's not saying that because it's part of this big, like, sort of, kind of this big organizational change, that there's ideas that you can't just adopt and go, we'll do that bit. And that has real intrinsic value. So, yeah. Don't just say, I'm not going to do the whole thing, therefore I'm not going to do any of it.
Okay, perfect. We probably have time for one, possibly two more questions, but let's dive right into it. Ayman has asked a question. As I understand it, we can build many lake houses to build a data mesh, but at this point, will we need expertises and new efforts to manage all these lake houses? And so the quick answer is that yes and no. And the reason I'm saying yes and no is because the whole purpose of having a data mesh is that the individual team, the people that own the lake house, they're the ones that actually control both the input, what data goes into the system, and just as importantly, more importantly, in fact, what's the output? In other words, these are the contracts that we put in place on exactly what data we are delivering and how fast or the frequency or latency by which we're delivering that data. So you are going to need more expertise, but the context is the expertise on each individual lakehouse. It's not necessarily for the whole mesh.
Yeah.
Going back to the way we described it, yes, there usually is for successful, at least I've found in general, for most successful data meshes, there is a central core team, often for governance, but often also for, and not just for governance, but the definitions of data, which often is deemed under governance, is also included in that concept. And so they might not necessarily build everything, but they will at least at a minimum define everything. And more times than not, they're usually building some central core system anyways. So that's usually what ends up happening. And so there is going to be more expertise overall, but it's not specifically to say that you need more data mesh experts per se. There will be some from a centralized governance perspective, but the thing is that even from a centralized governance perspective, you always needed governance, whether it was a lakehouse or a mesh in the first place. Anything else you want to add? Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of comes into that, the pragmatic approach that we end up building for people who are like, we want to do federated analytics. We want to stand up various different business domains doing analytics, different analytics teams embedded into different parts of the business. So we're not talking about changing all sources of data into this massive mesh and changing the entire organization. We're saying we're pulling data from all these different operational sources. We want to enable that team to deliver their own analytical products, that team to deliver their own. And so they're already talking about teams who have data skills, who have kind of, some tech. Now, so they might be kind of building data marts or kind of, they might be building self-service dashboards, that kind of thing. And they're the kind of teams, if they were standing up their own kind of lake house kind of things, and you're enabling that with a set of patterns, a set of processes to get that to work quickly. So they're not having to reinvent the entire Python wheel every time they do anything. That is absolutely fine. But from the fundamental tenets of mesh, that's not really a mesh. That's a half-hearted approach to do as something which we've been calling federated analytics for a long time. Exactly. So that's not really a data mesh. But you can still take the principles and the learnings and treating each thing as an analytical product, treating each team as a decentralized team, treating each one with some self-service analytics infrastructure they can spin up. All of those lessons still absolutely make sense to it. Have you implemented a data mesh? Technically, no. Are you doing things at the best way for your business? Yeah, great, good. Then you're delivering value and you're actually serving the purpose.
Perfect.
Stop ranting. Sorry.
Yes, I think we should both stop ranting now. It's already 9:52 a.m. Pacific, so we're a little past the time. So apologies for us not answering all your questions, if for some of the questions we might have missed. So apologies. This was not on purpose. We were surprised by the number of questions that came through at the last second. Please, if you've got any questions, just join us at the Delta user Slack, go.delta.io/Slack. We're on there to answer questions there too. If data mesh ends up becoming a popular enough concept, we'll create a Delta data mesh channel, and then we can start ranting in there as well. So just join and let us know. With that, thanks very much, everybody. I really appreciate your time. Simon, thank you like always.
Always a pleasure.
Perfect. Well, see us in a month. We'll ranting about something else. So appreciate everybody. Thanks very much for joining today.